Have you ever felt like you are emotionally alone even while being in a relationship? Like you are standing next to someone who says they care about you, but still feels far away? If yes, then you already know the quiet kind of pain that most people cannot understand. The kind of pain that does not scream, it whispers, it stays, it builds inside your chest when you expect warmth but receive distance instead. And when this happens with an avoidant partner, it can feel even more confusing. Because they are not completely gone. They are not completely present either. They exist somewhere in between. And that in between is what slowly starts to affect your mind, your emotions, and your sense of self. You start questioning simple things. You replay conversations in your head. You wonder why they were close yesterday but distant today. You try to find logic in emotional inconsistency, but the more you try to understand it, the more lost you feel inside it. And here is something important to understand from the very beginning. What you are feeling is not weakness. It is not overthinking. It is your emotional system trying to make sense of unpredictability. Human beings are wired for emotional safety. The brain feels calm when love is consistent, when attention is stable, when presence is predictable. But when love becomes unpredictable, the brain does something very powerful. It starts searching for patterns. It starts trying harder. It starts attaching deeper, even when it hurts. That is why being with an avoidant partner can feel so emotionally intense, because they do not give love in a steady flow. They often give it in waves, sometimes close, sometimes distant, sometimes warm, sometimes unavailable. And this inconsistency creates something powerful inside the mind called emotional fixation. You do not just love them. You start chasing the version of them that feels close, warm, and available. And every time they withdraw, your mind feels the loss even more deeply. Not because love is increasing, but because uncertainty is increasing. And slowly, without even realizing it, your emotional world starts revolving around their behavior. Their mood becomes your peace. Their distance becomes your anxiety. Their attention becomes your relief. This is how emotional imbalance begins. But there is something deeper happening here that most people never notice. When love feels unpredictable, the brain does not always interpret it as rejection. Sometimes it interprets it as, try harder. It believes that if you just say the right thing, act the right way, or love more deeply, you might finally receive consistency. So you keep investing. You keep hoping. You keep adjusting yourself, and this is where emotional exhaustion begins. Because the truth is, you are trying to build emotional safety in a place that does not naturally offer stability. And this is not about blaming the other person. It is about understanding the pattern you are caught in. If you are here right now, listening to this, there is a high chance you are already feeling that emotional weight. The overthinking, the waiting, the confusion, the silent sadness you cannot fully explain to anyone. But there is something you need to hear clearly before going deeper into this. You are not crazy for feeling attached. You are not weak for caring deeply. You are not wrong for wanting consistency. You are simply human, responding to emotional uncertainty in the only way the human mind knows how, by trying to hold on tighter. And this is exactly why this topic matters so deeply, because most people never understand what is actually happening inside them when they are in a relationship with an avoidant partner. They think it is just love problems or communication issues, but it goes much deeper than that. It is about emotional regulation, attachment patterns, and the way the brain reacts to inconsistency. And when you finally understand this, something starts to change inside you. You stop blaming yourself. You stop chasing blindly. You start seeing clearly. But this is just the beginning, because understanding the pain is not enough. You also need to understand how to respond to it without losing yourself in the process. And if you stay until the end of this journey, you will begin to see something very important. Not just about them, but about you. about your emotional patterns, about your attachment, and about the quiet strength you may have forgotten you already have. Because the goal here is not just to survive emotional distance. The real goal is to stop losing yourself inside it. You may start to notice something strange when you are involved with an avoidant partner. One moment, everything feels warm and connected, and in the next moment, there is silence that feels heavier than words. This sudden shift is not just emotional confusion. It creates a psychological loop that keeps your mind constantly alert, always waiting for the next change. This happens because inconsistency affects the human nervous system in a very specific way. The mind does not relax when it cannot predict what comes next. Instead, it stays active, scanning for signals, trying to prepare for emotional change before it happens. When someone is emotionally steady, your system settles naturally. But when someone moves closer and then suddenly pulls away, your internal balance keeps breaking and rebuilding again and again. Over time, this creates a habit inside you. You begin to observe them more than you observe yourself. You start measuring your emotional state based on their presence or absence. If they are close, you feel relief. If they are distant, you feel tension. Slowly, your emotional center shifts outside of you, and that is where confusion deepens. One of the strongest effects of this pattern is mental overactivity. You begin to analyze small behaviors. A short reply feels meaningful. A delayed response feels personal. A change in tone becomes something you try to decode. The mind becomes busy trying to fill in emotional gaps, even when there is no clear information available. This is not because you are imagining things, but because uncertainty forces the mind to create meaning where clarity is missing. Another important layer is emotional anticipation. Instead of living in the present moment, your attention starts living in expectation. You begin to prepare for withdrawal, even during moments of closeness. This creates a strange internal contradiction, where you cannot fully enjoy connection, because part of you is waiting for it to disappear again. This emotional state can become tiring without you realizing it. You may feel mentally active all the time, yet emotionally drained at the same time. The reason is simple. Your system is working constantly without resolution. There is no steady outcome for your emotional effort, so the mind keeps trying harder, hoping to finally find stability. At this stage, self-doubt can slowly start forming, not as a loud thought, but as a quiet question that repeats in different ways. You may start wondering if you are too sensitive, too demanding, or too emotional. These thoughts do not appear all at once. They build gradually through repeated experiences of inconsistency. But what is actually happening is not about your personality. It is about how repeated emotional unpredictability can influence perception. When someone's behavior is not steady, the brain often turns inward for explanation. It assumes the cause must be personal, because external behavior feels confusing. This internalization is what creates emotional heaviness over time. There is also something else that plays a powerful role here: intermittent connection. When affection is not consistent but appears occasionally, it becomes more mentally engaging. The mind holds on to those moments more strongly than the absence in between. This creates emotional imbalance where rare moments of closeness feel more valuable than steady stability would. This is why letting go of emotional focus becomes difficult. It is not just attachment to a person. It is attachment to the pattern of unpredictability itself. The highs feel meaningful because they contrast with the lows, and without realizing it, the emotional system begins to chase relief instead of peace. During this process, personal needs often get pushed aside. You may begin to reduce your expectations just to maintain connection. You adjust your communication style. You wait longer before expressing feelings. You try to avoid anything that might create distance. These changes happen quietly, but they gradually reshape how you behave in relationships. The challenge here is that the more you adapt to inconsistency, the more normal it begins to feel. What once felt confusing slowly becomes familiar, and what becomes familiar often starts to feel acceptable, even if it creates internal discomfort. But beneath all of this, your emotional system is still seeking one thing: stability. Not intensity, not uncertainty, not guessing, just stability. A steady emotional environment where you do not have to question where you stand or what to expect next. Understanding this is important because it helps separate emotional experience from emotional interpretation. The experience is what is happening externally. The interpretation is how your mind is processing it internally. And often, the internal interpretation carries more weight than the actual situation itself. When this separation becomes clear, something shifts quietly within you. You begin to observe instead of absorb. You notice patterns without immediately reacting to them. You start recognizing how your emotional state is being influenced rather than fully controlled. And in that awareness, a small space begins to open. A space where you are no longer fully inside the reaction, but slightly outside of it. That space becomes important later, because it is where emotional clarity slowly starts to grow. At some point, you may begin to notice that the emotional pattern is not just affecting how you feel, but also how you see yourself. When attention is inconsistent, the mind does something very subtle. It starts connecting emotional distance with personal meaning. Not because it is true, but because the human brain naturally searches for reasons when clarity is missing. This is where internal questioning begins to grow. You may not even realize it at first. It can show up in small thoughts like why things feel different now, or what changed that caused the shift. These questions slowly build into deeper emotional reflections about your own worth, behavior, or presence in the relationship. What makes this stage difficult is that it does not feel like pressure from the outside. It feels like pressure from within. And internal pressure is often harder to recognize because it feels like your own voice. But in reality, it is shaped by repeated experiences of uncertainty that the mind is trying to explain. When emotional responses are not predictable, the mind often fills the gaps with self-focused interpretation. This means instead of looking outward at behavior patterns, attention turns inward toward personal responsibility. The logic becomes simple, but misleading. If the connection feels unstable, then something must be wrong internally. This is how emotional distortion quietly develops. It does not arrive suddenly. It builds through repetition. Each moment of confusion adds another layer of interpretation. Each unanswered emotional need strengthens the internal search for explanation. And slowly, perception begins to shift. During this phase, emotional confidence can weaken without obvious signs. It is not that you stop caring about yourself. It is that your attention becomes divided. Part of you continues to invest emotionally, while another part starts monitoring your own actions constantly, trying to prevent further distance. This internal monitoring can create exhaustion, because instead of simply experiencing a relationship, you begin to manage your own behavior within it. You may find yourself adjusting tone, timing, or expression in order to maintain connection. Over time, this creates a sense of emotional self-restraint that feels heavy and continuous. Another important element here is emotional dependency on response patterns. When someone's engagement is irregular, each moment of connection becomes highly significant. A simple message or gesture may temporarily lift emotional tension, but when it disappears again, the contrast becomes even more noticeable. This cycle creates a rhythm inside the mind that is difficult to break. The emotional system starts reacting more strongly to changes than to stability itself. Calm moments feel uncertain because they are followed by unpredictability. And unpredictable moments feel intense because they break calmness. In this state, emotional memory also becomes selective. The mind tends to hold on to meaningful peaks of connection while minimizing periods of distance. This creates an internal picture that feels emotionally charged but incomplete. It is this selective memory that often strengthens attachment, even when the overall experience is inconsistent. As this continues, personal identity can begin to feel slightly blurred. You may notice that your emotional state is no longer steady within yourself. It rises and falls based on interaction patterns. When connection is present, there is emotional relief. When it is absent, there is emotional tension. Over time, this creates reliance on external signals for internal balance. One of the most challenging parts of this stage is the silent adjustment of expectations. Without consciously deciding it, you may start lowering emotional needs just to maintain continuity. This is not a decision made with awareness. It is a gradual adaptation to avoid emotional disruption. But in doing so, internal boundaries become less defined. Emotional tolerance increases, while emotional clarity decreases. You may accept situations that previously felt uncomfortable, simply because consistency feels more important than comfort in that moment. This shift can also influence communication style. Expression becomes more cautious. Feelings are sometimes delayed or softened. There may be a tendency to avoid topics that could create emotional withdrawal. These changes are subtle, but they reshape interaction patterns over time. At the core of all this is a deeper psychological mechanism. The mind is constantly trying to restore emotional balance. When balance is missing, it adapts by reducing resistance. It tries to keep connection alive by minimizing emotional friction. But this adaptation comes at the cost of self-expression. Eventually, a quiet realization may begin to form, not as a sudden thought, but as a gradual awareness. The realization that emotional effort is not leading to stability, that adjusting behavior is not creating consistency, that internal effort alone cannot control external unpredictability. This is an important turning point because it introduces clarity without forcing change. It allows observation without immediate reaction. And in that observation, emotional patterns become easier to recognize as patterns rather than personal reflections. When this understanding begins to settle, attention slowly starts returning inward in a different way. Not as self-blame, but as self-awareness. The focus shifts from trying to manage external responses to understanding internal reactions. And this shift marks the beginning of emotional reorientation, not away from connection itself, but away from losing internal stability inside connection. At this stage, something important begins to surface inside your awareness, not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet internal shift. You start to notice that the more you try to secure emotional certainty from the other person, the more unstable your inner world becomes. This recognition does not come with noise. It comes with observation. And observation is often the beginning of real change. When emotional stability is missing in an interaction, the mind often attempts to compensate by increasing effort. It tries different approaches, different expressions, different levels of patience. The intention is simple: to create consistency through adjustment. But what slowly becomes clear is that emotional stability cannot be manufactured through personal effort alone when the other side is not offering steady presence. This creates an important internal contrast. On one side, there is your consistent emotional investment. On the other side, there is unpredictability in response. And between these two, your inner balance starts to stretch. The more the stretch continues, the more you begin to feel a quiet form of emotional fatigue that is not tied to a single moment, but to the overall pattern. During this period, awareness becomes a powerful tool, because awareness does not require immediate change. It simply requires seeing things as they are. And when you start seeing clearly, you begin to recognize that your emotional state has been reacting more to inconsistency than to actual connection. This recognition can feel both unsettling and relieving at the same time. Unsettling, because it reveals how much internal energy has been directed toward maintaining emotional alignment. Relieving, because it explains why things have felt heavier than they should. One of the most important insights here is understanding the difference between emotional responsibility and emotional ownership. Emotional responsibility is about how you respond to situations. Emotional ownership is about feeling responsible for how someone else behaves or withdraws. And in situations with irregular emotional engagement, these two often get blurred without intention. When that blur happens, self-perception begins to shift. You may start believing that adjusting yourself more will reduce emotional distance. You may think that if you communicate differently or behave more carefully, the pattern will change. But what this does is increase internal pressure without changing the external rhythm. This is where emotional tension quietly builds, not through conflict, but through continuous adaptation. Each adjustment feels small, but together they create a consistent internal strain. Over time, this strain can affect how you experience even neutral moments. Calm becomes uncertain because it is no longer predictable. Silence becomes heavy because it is no longer neutral. Another layer that becomes visible at this stage is emotional dependency on reassurance cycles. When reassurance is not steady, the mind begins to value it more intensely when it appears. This creates an imbalance in emotional perception. Moments of connection feel amplified, while gaps feel exaggerated. This amplification does not come from imagination. It comes from contrast. The greater the difference between presence and absence, the stronger each experience feels. And when the mind repeatedly experiences this contrast, it begins to prioritize emotional highs over emotional stability. But stability is what the nervous system naturally seeks. Not intensity, not uncertainty. Stability. When that stability is missing, the system stays alert, even during calm periods. It anticipates change, even when nothing is happening. This is why peace can sometimes feel unfamiliar after repeated inconsistency. At this point, you may also notice a shift in how you interpret time within the relationship. Waiting becomes more emotionally charged. Short delays feel longer than they are. Absence feels stretched. This is because emotional anticipation begins to replace emotional presence. You are no longer fully inside the moment. You are partly inside expectation. Expectation keeps the mind active. It keeps it engaged in future outcomes rather than present experience. And when expectation is not met consistently, it creates cycles of disappointment that feel internal rather than external. One of the most subtle but powerful effects of this experience is emotional self-monitoring. You may start checking your own reactions more often. You may question whether you are being too expressive or not expressive enough. This internal monitoring creates a layer of self-observation that can reduce emotional spontaneity. Over time, spontaneity gets replaced with calculation. Natural response gets replaced with careful response. This does not happen suddenly. It develops gradually through repeated experiences where emotional expression does not always lead to predictable outcomes. However, within this process, awareness continues to grow. And awareness slowly begins to separate identity from reaction. You start noticing that your emotional responses are influenced by patterns, not permanent truths about yourself. This separation is subtle but significant. It allows you to observe emotional movement without fully becoming it. Instead of being inside every reaction, you begin to witness it. Instead of absorbing every emotional shift, you begin to recognize it. And with that recognition, something important begins to form. Space. Space between stimulus and response. Space between behavior and interpretation. Space between external action and internal reaction. That space is where clarity starts to develop, not as immediate answers, but as the ability to see without distortion. And once that clarity begins to grow, emotional experience no longer feels entirely automatic. It starts to feel observable. This is the foundation of change. not changing the other person, not forcing outcomes, but understanding how internal experience has been shaped by repeated patterns and how awareness can slowly bring balance back into the system. And from this point forward, the focus begins to shift from trying to control emotional outcomes to understanding emotional structure itself.